In the glittering halls of Versailles, where mirrors reflected infinite splendor, and every surface gleamed with gold, a darker reflection haunted the throne of France. Louis XV, great-grandson of the Sun King, would earn a title that no amount of royal pageantry could wash away, the Libertine King. His reign, spanning nearly 6 decades from 1715 to 1774, would become synonymous not with military glory or enlightened reform, but with sexual excess that shocked even the permissive standards of 18th century aristocracy. The whispers began softly, like rustling silk in palace corridors. They spoke of a king whose appetites knew no bounds, whose agents scoured the streets of Paris for fresh conquests, whose secret residence housed a rotating cast of young women selected for their beauty and their silence. These were not merely the salacious rumors that accompanied every monarch. They were systematic, documented, and increasingly public scandals that would help topple an entire system of government. What makes Louis XV's story particularly disturbing is not simply the scale of his sexual pursuits, but the machinery of exploitation that supported them. This was not a tale of royal romance or even simple adultery. It was an institutionalized system that commodified women, corrupted governance, and ultimately contributed to the revolutionary fervor that would claim his grandson's head at the guillotine. The practices we examine tonight were not just personal failings. They were symptoms of a diseased absolutism that viewed human beings as disposable pleasures. To understand how a boy king, once beloved as Louis the Well-Beloved, transformed into a symbol of royal depravity, we must first understand the world that created him. The Versailles of Louis XV was not merely a palace, but a theatrical stage where power, pleasure, and politics performed an endless ballet. Every mistress was a political statement, every liaison a potential shift in the balance of European power. In this glittering prison, where courtiers spent fortunes on appearances while peasants starved, the king's bedroom became the true throne room of France. The documentary evidence we possess comes from multiple sources: diplomatic dispatches from shocked foreign ambassadors, police reports from the Lieutenant General of Paris, memoirs of courtiers who witnessed the scandals firsthand, and perhaps most damningly, the pornographic pamphlets that flooded France in the years before Revolution. These libelles, as they were known, mixed truth with fiction so thoroughly that historians still struggle to separate fact from propaganda. Yet even the most conservative historical accounts paint a picture of systematic sexual exploitation that would be considered trafficking by modern standards. Consider this: while Louis XV enjoyed his pleasures, France lost an empire. The 7 Years' War stripped France of Canada and India, while the royal treasury hemorrhaged gold to pay for the king's mistress's diamonds. The contrast was not lost on contemporary observers. Voltaire, writing from his exile, noted with bitter irony that the king seemed more interested in conquering bedchambers than battlefields. This was not merely moral condemnation, it was political prophecy. Tonight, we delve into the historical records, the eyewitness accounts, and the scholarly debates that surround one of history's most controversial monarchs. We will examine not just what Louis XV did, but how a system of absolute power enabled and encouraged such behavior. We will meet the women who shared his bed, some willing participants in the game of power, others victims of a system that gave them no choice. We will explore how sexual scandal became political weapon and how the king's private vices became public catastrophe. This is not a story for the faint of heart. It contains accounts of exploitation, trafficking, and abuse of power that remain shocking even by the standards of an age that knew little of human rights. Yet it is a story that must be told, for in the excesses of Louis XV, we see not just the corruption of one man, but the fatal flaws of a system that placed absolute power in mortal hands. The Libertine King's legacy extends far beyond the bedroom. It reaches into the very foundations of modern democracy. Born from the revolution, his excesses helped to spark the making of a libertine monarch. Louis XV ascended to the throne at the age of 5, orphaned and alone in a court that viewed him as both sacred vessel and political pawn. His great-grandfather, the Sun King Louis XIV, had died, leaving France exhausted from wars and crushed by debt. The boy king's early years were marked by the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, a period of notorious debauchery that would profoundly shape the young monarch's understanding of power and pleasure. The regent's own infamous orgies at the Palais Royal became the stuff of legend, normalizing sexual excess as a prerogative of power. The child who would become the Libertine King was initially sheltered from such influences by his governors, but the damage to the moral fabric of the court was already done. The Regency had established a new paradigm. After the suffocating piety of Louis XIV's final years under the influence of Madame de Maintenon, the aristocracy erupted in a frenzy of libertinage. The philosophical movement of libertinism, which rejected religious and moral constraints in favor of sensual pleasure and rational self-interest, found fertile ground in the highest circles of French society. Young Louis was beautiful, intelligent, and desperately lonely. Contemporary accounts describe a child of extraordinary physical beauty, tall for his age, with perfectly proportioned features and the Bourbon charm that seemed bred into the bone. Yet behind the regal facade was a boy traumatized by early losses. His parents had died when he was 2. His beloved governess, Madame de Ventadour, was dismissed when he reached the age of 7, and he was thrust into a world where everyone who approached him had ulterior motives. The sexual education of Louis XV began early, as was customary for royal princes. At 14, he was married to Marie Leszczyńska, daughter of the deposed King of Poland, a match chosen for political expedience rather than passion. The marriage was consummated when Louis was 15 and Marie 22, and initially the young king seemed devoted to his wife. They would have 10 children together in 10 years, but the constant pregnancies took their toll on the queen's health and appearance. By the time she was 35, Marie looked decades older, exhausted by childbearing and increasingly pious, withdrawing from the conjugal bed that had become for her a source of duty rather than pleasure. It was at this crucial juncture that Louis XV's transformation from devoted husband to notorious libertine began in earnest. The year was 1733, and the king was 23 years old. Courtiers, concerned about the king's melancholy and the cooling of the royal marriage bed, began to present possible mistresses. This was not seen as scandalous, but as politically necessary. A king without a mistress was considered somehow incomplete, potentially vulnerable to manipulation by other factions. The mistress, it was reasoned, would keep the king happy and manageable. The first of Louis's official mistresses was Louise Julie de Mailly-Nesle, but it was her younger sister Pauline Félicité who would introduce the king to the more adventurous pleasures that would define his reign. The Nesle sisters, for Louis would eventually take 4 of the 5 sisters as mistresses, established a pattern that would characterize the king's sexual pursuits. The systematic exploitation of family connections, the treatment of women as interchangeable commodities, and the complete disregard for conventional morality. When Pauline Félicité died suddenly in 1741, poisoning was suspected but never proven. The death of his favorite mistress seemed to unhinge something in Louis XV. He fell seriously ill during a military campaign in Metz in 1744, and in his delirium he publicly confessed his sins and begged forgiveness from the Queen. The nation rejoiced at their king's apparent reformation, bestowing upon him the title Louis the Well-Beloved, but the repentance was short-lived. Within months of his recovery, Louis had taken a new mistress, and this time he would choose someone who would fundamentally reshape not just his private life, but the very nature of royal mistressship in France. The stage was now set for the entrance of one of history's most famous royal mistresses, a woman whose influence would extend far beyond the bedroom and whose very name would become synonymous with power, culture, and the sophisticated corruption of the ancient regime. But before we meet Madame de Pompadour, we must understand the court system that made such figures not just possible, but necessary. A world where sex and power were so intertwined that to possess one without the other was considered not just unusual, but dangerous. The Pompadour system, sex as statecraft, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, who would become the Marquise de Pompadour, entered Louis XV's bed in 1745 and would remain the architect of his private life until her death in 1764. But to call her merely a mistress is to fundamentally misunderstand the role she played in transforming the king's libertinage from personal vice into state policy. Pompadour created what historians now call the system, a carefully orchestrated apparatus that managed the king's sexual appetites while maintaining her own political power long after their physical relationship had ended. Born into the bourgeoisie, Jeanne Antoinette had been groomed from childhood for the role of royal mistress. Her mother's lover, the wealthy financier Lenormand de Tournhem, had allegedly been told by a fortune-teller that the girl would one day capture a king's heart. She was educated in all the arts necessary to captivate a monarch. She could sing, dance, play the clavichord, paint, engrave, and most importantly, she possessed a wit and intelligence that far exceeded the typical court beauty. When she finally orchestrated her meeting with Louis XV at a masked ball celebrating the Dauphin's wedding, she was 23 and he was 34. The initial passion between Louis and his new mistress was intense and genuine. Contemporary accounts describe the king as utterly besotted, spending every possible moment in her company. But Pompadour understood something that her predecessors had not. Physical beauty fades, and royal desire is notoriously fickle. To maintain her position, she would need to make herself indispensable in ways that transcended the bedroom. Within 2 years of becoming the official mistress, she had largely ceased to be the king's sexual partner. A combination of her delicate health and his voracious appetites made their physical relationship unsustainable. What Pompadour did next was revolutionary in the history of royal mistresses. Rather than fight to maintain the king's exclusive sexual attention, she chose to manage and direct it. She became, in essence, the king's procurer, but with a sophistication and systematic approach that transformed casual debauchery into an institution. She understood that Louis required constant sexual novelty. His appetites had been shaped by decades of indulgence and required ever greater stimulation to achieve satisfaction. Rather than see this as a threat to her position, she made herself the indispensable facilitator of the king's desires. The mechanism she created was as brilliant as it was morally reprehensible. Pompadour established a network of agents throughout Paris and the provinces whose sole purpose was to identify young women who met the king's exacting standards. They must be beautiful, they must be young, increasingly so as Louis aged, they must be healthy, and most importantly, they must be disposable. These were not courtesans or even daughters of the minor nobility who might have political ambitions. These were working-class girls, often teenagers, who could be used and discarded without creating political complications. The operational center of this system was a modest house in the town of Versailles, purchased by the king in 1755 and known as the Parc aux Cerfs, literally the deer park. The name itself was a cruel joke. These young women were the deer to be hunted by the royal stag. The house was staffed by a skeleton crew of servants who were paid extraordinary wages for their silence. A woman known as Madame Bertrand served as the governess, maintaining discipline and ensuring that the girls understood the rules of their gilded captivity. The girls brought to the Parc aux Cerfs were told various stories to explain their situation. Some were informed they would be serving a wealthy Polish nobleman the king would visit in disguise. Others were told they were being trained for positions at court. Many were purchased outright from their families, who were either desperate for money or dazzled by the prospect of royal favor. The prices paid were substantial. Records indicate sums ranging from 10,000 to 50,000 livres, enormous amounts that could transform a working-class family's fortunes overnight. Once installed in the Parc aux Cerfs, the girls lived in a strange limbo. They were well-fed, elegantly dressed, and given basic education in reading, writing, and the social graces. They were also regularly examined by royal physicians to ensure they were free from disease. Venereal disease was the terror of the age, and Louis was obsessively concerned with his health. When the king visited, usually 2 or 3 times a week, the chosen girl would be prepared like a sacrifice on an altar, bathed, perfumed, dressed in fine lingerie, and instructed in exactly how to please their mysterious benefactor. The scale of this operation remains a matter of historical debate. Contemporary pamphleteers claimed that hundreds of girls passed through the Parc aux Cerfs during its years of operation. More conservative historians suggest the number was closer to 30 or 40. What is not disputed is that the system existed, that it was funded by the royal treasury at enormous expense, and that it represented a level of organized sexual exploitation that shocked even the permissive standards of 18th century France. The records that survive, primarily in the French National Archives, paint a picture of industrial-scale debauchery managed with bureaucratic efficiency, the economics of royal lust. The financial cost of Louis XV's sexual appetites was staggering, and in an age when France teetered perpetually on the edge of bankruptcy, these expenses became a matter of state concern. The Parc aux Cerfs alone cost the treasury an estimated 100,000 livres per year to maintain, a sum that could have paid the annual wages of over 200 skilled artisans. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg. The true cost of the king's libertinage must be measured not just in the direct expenses of procurement and maintenance, but in the vast network of pensions, gifts, and hush money that kept the system functioning. Each girl who entered the Parc aux Cerfs represented a complex financial transaction. First came the acquisition cost, the payment to the family or to the procurers who identified suitable candidates. Then came the maintenance, clothing, food, servants, education, and medical care. When a girl's tenure ended, either because the king tired of her, she became pregnant, or she grew too old for his tastes, she required compensation for her silence. This typically took the form of a pension, a dowry for marriage, or a position for her future husband. If she had borne the king a child, the costs multiplied exponentially. The children of the Parc aux Cerfs presented a particular problem. These bastards could not be acknowledged publicly, yet royal blood demanded certain considerations. They were typically sent to convents or monasteries with generous endowments, or married off with substantial dowries to minor nobles, willing to overlook their origins. The Comte de Mercy-Argenteau, Austrian ambassador to France, estimated in a dispatch to Maria Theresa that the king was supporting at least 30 illegitimate children through various anonymous channels, each costing the treasury thousands of livres annually. But the financial hemorrhaging extended far beyond the Parc aux Cerfs. The official mistresses, Pompadour and later du Barry, commanded resources that dwarfed these clandestine expenses. Pompadour alone is estimated to have cost the French treasury over 36 million livres during her 20-year tenure. She built or renovated numerous chateaux, amassed one of the finest art collections in Europe, and maintained a household that rivaled that of the Queen herself. Her brother was made Marquis de Marigny and given control of the royal buildings, a position he used to funnel enormous sums to his sister's projects. The corruption spread like a disease through the body politic. Positions were sold to finance the king's pleasures. Military commands went to the highest bidder rather than the most competent officer. And tax farmers grew rich on commissions while the people groaned under ever-increasing burdens. The Controller General of Finances, Machault d'Arnouville, attempted to introduce taxes on the nobility and clergy to address the fiscal crisis, but Pompadour, protecting her network of noble allies, had him dismissed. The pattern repeated itself with every minister who attempted reform. The international implications were equally devastating. During the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, while French armies were being decimated in Europe and French colonies were falling to the British across the globe, Louis XV spent 1.2 million livres renovating the Petit Trianon for Pompadour. The contrast was not lost on French officers dying in Canadian snows or Indian jungles. Marshal de Broglie wrote bitterly from the Rhine front that his men lacked basic supplies while perfumed parasites at Versailles bathe in champagne and roll in silk. The secret service of the king, the Cabinet Noir, or Black Cabinet, which was supposed to intercept and analyze foreign diplomatic correspondence, was increasingly diverted to managing the king's sexual affairs. Agents who should have been gathering intelligence on Austria or Britain were instead tracking down rumors about pregnant former mistresses or suppressing pamphlets that detailed the king's debaucheries. The Lieutenant General of Police, Berryer, complained in his private papers that half his force was occupied with the king's private matters rather than maintaining public order. Foreign powers quickly learned to exploit this weakness. Frederick the Great of Prussia, with characteristic cynicism, instructed his ambassadors to identify potential mistresses who could be used to influence French policy. The British Foreign Office maintained detailed files on every woman who entered the king's bed, analyzing their political connections and potential vulnerabilities. The Austrians, through their ambassador Mercy Argenteau, cultivated Pompadour assiduously, ultimately securing the reversal of centuries of French foreign policy through what contemporaries called the Petticoat Alliance. Perhaps most damaging was the effect on public confidence in the monarchy. In an age before mass media, the primary source of news for most French citizens was rumor and pamphlet. The libelles that circulated throughout France painted increasingly lurid pictures of royal debauchery, and while many of the specific details were exaggerated or fabricated, the core truth that the king was spending vast sums on sexual gratification while the nation suffered was undeniable. The economist Turgot calculated that the total cost of the king's mistresses and illegitimate children over his reign exceeded the entire annual revenue of the French state. The Du Barry scandal, descent into depravity. When Madame de Pompadour died in 1764, Louis XV was 54 years old and showing no signs of reforming his libertine ways. If anything, her death removed the last restraints on his behavior. For 4 years, the king indulged in a series of increasingly sordid affairs, but the informal nature of these liaisons created a power vacuum at court. Into this vacuum stepped one of the most controversial figures of the Ancien Régime, Jeanne Bécu, Comtesse du Barry, whose very presence at Versailles would become a symbol of the monarchy's moral bankruptcy. Du Barry's origins were even more scandalous than Pompadour's bourgeois roots. She was, by any contemporary definition, a prostitute. Born illegitimate to a seamstress and an unknown father, Jeanne had worked in a millinery shop before becoming the mistress of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a notorious pimp who ran a high-class gambling den and brothel for aristocrats. Contemporary police records preserved in the Archives Nationales showed that she was registered as a courtesan and had entertained numerous clients from the nobility. Her professional name was Mademoiselle Lange, and she was renowned for her sexual expertise and willingness to accommodate any desire. The meeting between Louis XV and Jeanne was orchestrated by Jean-Baptiste du Barry with the precision of a military campaign. He understood that the aging king, now approaching 60, required more than mere beauty. He needed someone who could rekindle his flagging virility. Jeanne, at 25, possessed not just extraordinary beauty, but a sexual repertoire honed by years of professional experience. When she was presented to the king in 1768, she deployed every technique in her considerable arsenal. The king was instantly enslaved. The court was horrified. While Pompadour had at least possessed education, wit, and a veneer of respectability, du Barry was openly, flagrantly common. She spoke with a Parisian street accent she never bothered to refine. Her laughter was too loud, her gestures too expansive. She addressed duchesses as equals and treated the ancient protocols of Versailles as amusing suggestions rather than sacred laws. Most shocking of all, she made no attempt to hide her past or apologize for it. When the Duchesse de Gramont pointedly asked about her origins, du Barry replied with a smile, "I came from wherever beautiful women come from, and I'm going wherever they go." The installation of du Barry as official mistress required overcoming a significant legal obstacle. She needed to be married to a nobleman to be presented at court. Jean-Baptiste du Barry solved this by marrying her to his own brother, Guillaume, an impoverished country gentleman who was paid handsomely to participate in the charade and then immediately sent back to his estates. The marriage contract, still preserved in the archives, is a masterpiece of legal fiction, creating an entirely fabricated genealogy for Jeanne that transformed her from bastard prostitute to respectable countess. The presentation of Madame du Barry at court on April 22, 1769, was one of the most dramatic moments in Versailles history. The Queen, Marie Leschinska, had died the previous year, removing one potential source of opposition, but the Dauphin and Dauphine led a boycott of the ceremony. Most of the high nobility refused to acknowledge du Barry's presence, turning their backs when she passed. The king's own daughters, known collectively as mesdames, waged a relentless campaign against her, referring to her only as that creature and organizing what amounted to a social guerrilla war. But Louis XV was beyond caring about court opinion. His infatuation with du Barry exceeded even his earlier passion for Pompadour. He lavished upon her gifts that beggared description. The Château de Louveciennes, purchased and renovated at a cost of 2 million livres, a set of diamonds worth 400,000 livres, an annual pension of 300,000 livres, and countless other presents of jewelry, art, and cash. The royal jewelers, Böhmer and Bassange, later testified that du Barry's purchases in a single year exceeded what the Queen had bought in a decade. More disturbing than the financial extravagance was the nature of the relationship itself. Du Barry introduced the aging king to sexual practices that scandalized even the Libertine court. Reports from foreign ambassadors, particularly the Spanish and Austrian envoys who had access to court gossip, describe orgies at Louveciennes that involved multiple participants, elaborate role-playing scenarios, and the use of various mechanical devices imported from Italy. The Duc de Croix, in his memoirs, hints at scenes that would make Tiberius blush, referring to the famously depraved Roman emperor. The Parc aux Cerfs, which had at least maintained a facade of discretion under Pompadour's management, became, under du Barry's influence, something approaching a brothel. The pretense that the girls didn't know their visitor's identity was abandoned. They were now explicitly told they were servicing the king and were encouraged to compete for his favors. Du Barry would sometimes participate in these encounters, directing the proceedings like a madam managing her establishment. The Marquis de Sade, who knew du Barry personally, later claimed that some of his literary scenarios were inspired by stories she had told him about the king's preferences. The political consequences were catastrophic. The new Controller General of Finances, Abbé Terray, was a creature of du Barry's who owed his position to her influence. His financial policies, designed primarily to maintain the flow of funds to the royal mistress, pushed France closer to bankruptcy. The Parlement of Paris, the closest thing France had to a check on royal power, was dismissed when it protested the fiscal abuses. Foreign policy became a joke. Du Barry openly sold her influence to the highest bidder, and diplomatic appointments were made based on the size of the bribe rather than competence or experience. The shadow network, procurement and trafficking, behind the glittering facade of royal mistresses and the semi-official establishment of the Parc aux Cerfs, lay a darker reality, an extensive network of procurers, middlemen, and human traffickers who supplied the raw material for Louis XV's pleasures. This shadow network, operating in the grey zones between legality and crime, between consent and coercion, represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the king's sexual practices. The machinery of procurement was as complex as any government bureaucracy, and in many ways more efficient. At the apex of this network sat a figure known in police records only as Le Bel, the king's premier valet de chambre and most trusted servant. Dominique Guillaume Le Bel was more than a servant. He was the king's primary procurer, the man responsible for ensuring a steady supply of fresh faces and bodies. His apartments in Versailles served as a kind of clearinghouse where potential candidates were evaluated, processed, and prepared for royal consumption. Lebel maintained detailed records, rating women on various attributes: beauty, compliance, discretion, and particular skills. These records, partially preserved in the archives secrets, read like a livestock inventory. Beneath Lebel operated a network of scouts throughout Paris and the provinces. These were often women, former prostitutes, midwives, seamstresses, who had access to young girls from poor families. They received regular payments from the royal treasury, disguised as pensions for various fictional services. Madame Gourdon, who ran one of Paris's most exclusive brothels, was a regular supplier. Her establishment served as a kind of proving ground where girls were tested for their suitability before being offered to the king. Police records show that Gourdin received annual payments of 50,000 livres from sources that traced back to the royal household. The methods of procurement varied depending on the target. For girls from respectable but impoverished families, the approach was often through offers of positions at court, lady's maid, seamstress, or other servant roles. Parents would be told their daughters had attracted the notice of a high-ranking courtier who wished to sponsor their education and advancement. Only after the girl was installed in the Parc aux Cerfs or one of the other houses maintained for the king's use would the true nature of her position become clear. By then, isolated from family and entirely dependent on royal favor, resistance was nearly impossible. For girls already working in prostitution, the recruitment was more straightforward, but no less coercive. They would be arrested on various pretexts and offered a choice: prison or service to a special client. Those who agreed were cleaned up, given medical examinations, and taught the particular preferences of their royal customer. The police inspector Mares, whose reports survive in remarkable detail, documented dozens of such cases. He noted with bureaucratic precision the girls' names, ages, physical descriptions, and eventual dispositions. The trafficking extended beyond France's borders. There are documented cases of girls being brought from Italy, Germany, and even England to serve the king's appetites. The Comte de Broglie, who served as head of the king's secret diplomatic service, complained that his agents were being diverted from intelligence gathering to shopping for merchandise in foreign markets. Nay, a particularly disturbing case involved twin sisters from Bavaria, aged 14, who were purchased from their parents and brought to France under the pretense of being trained as court musicians. Their fate after entering the king's service is unknown. The role of the medical profession in this system deserves special attention. Royal physicians, sworn to protect the king's health, became accomplices in the exploitation. Dr. Guénet, first physician to the king, conducted regular examinations of all girls intended for royal use. His medical notes, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, reveal a cold, clinical approach to human trafficking. Girls were tested for virginity, examined for signs of disease, and evaluated for their likelihood of becoming pregnant. Those who passed were certified like produce being approved for market. The psychological manipulation employed was sophisticated and systematic. Girls were isolated from outside contact, made entirely dependent on their handlers for food, clothing, and shelter. They were told that their families had sold them, that they had no alternatives, that resistance would result in imprisonment or worse. Some were drugged with opiates to make them more compliant. The Swiss guard officer Baron de Besenval, in his memoirs, describes finding a girl who had attempted suicide rather than submit to the king's advances. She was quietly removed and replaced, her fate unrecorded. The numbers involved remained disputed. Revolutionary prosecutors claimed that thousands of girls had passed through the king's hands during his reign. Royalist historians counted that the number was in the dozens. Modern scholarship, based on financial records and demographic analysis, suggests a middle ground. Probably hundreds of women and girls were procured for the king over the course of his reign, with the parc aux cerfs representing only the most formal and visible part of the system. Each represented a human tragedy, a life derailed for royal pleasure. The complicity required to maintain this system extended throughout French society. Priests who should have protested remained silent, bought off with benefices and appointments. Magistrates who should have investigated looked the other way, understanding that curiosity about the king's private affairs was a career-ending mistake. Even parents faced with poverty and the promise of royal gold sold their daughters into gilded slavery. The corruption was total, a cancer that metastasized through every institution meant to protect the vulnerable. The children of shadows, royal bastards, and their fates. The inevitable consequence of Louis XV's systematic debauchery was a shadow population of illegitimate children scattered across France like guilty secrets. These children, bearing royal blood but denied royal recognition, represent one of the most tragic aspects of the king's sexual practices. Their stories, pieced together from baptismal records, convent archives, and revolutionary investigations, reveal the human cost of royal libertinage. Each child was a living reminder of a system that treated human beings as disposable pleasures, their lives shaped forever by the circumstances of their conception. The exact number of Louis XV's illegitimate children will never be known. Official records acknowledge only those born to recognized mistresses like Pompadour, who had miscarriages but no living children with the king, and the Mélinel sisters. But the children of the parc aux cerfs and other casual liaisons existed in a legal and social limbo. Revolutionary investigators claim to have identified over 50 bastards of the late king, though this number was likely inflated for propaganda purposes. Modern historians generally accept that Louis fathered at least 30 illegitimate children who survived to adulthood. The fate of these children varied dramatically depending on their mother's status and the king's mood at the time of their birth. Those born to noble mistresses might receive titles, pensions, and positions at court. Charles de Vintimille, son of Pauline Félicité de Nesle, was acknowledged privately, if not publicly, and received a military commission and substantial estates. But he died at 27 under mysterious circumstances, possibly poisoned by rivals who feared his potential claim to influence. His death certificate, preserved in parish records, lists the cause as sudden fever, a common euphemism for poisoning. The children born to the girls of the parc aux cerfs faced a much grimmer fate. Immediately after birth, they were taken from their mothers and placed with wet nurses in the countryside. The mothers, having served their purpose, were dismissed with a pension and strict orders never to attempt contact with their children. Many of these women, traumatized and cast adrift, ended up in convents, madhouses, or back in prostitution. The police archives contain heartbreaking letters from mothers attempting to learn the fate of their children, all unanswered. The boys were typically placed in military schools or seminaries, given false identities and modest pensions. The Abbé de Bourbon, who claimed to be Louis XV's son by a chambermaid, spent his life in obscure parishes, forever barred from advancement in the church hierarchy. His letters to various ministers, begging for recognition or at least increased financial support, paint a picture of bitter frustration and wasted potential. He died in 1790, just as the revolution was sweeping away the world that had rejected him. The girls faced even more limited options. Most were placed in convents as perpetual boarders, neither nuns nor free women. The convent of the Assumption in Paris housed at least 6 daughters of Louis XV, according to revolutionary inventories. These women lived lives of enforced piety and isolation, their royal blood a secret shame rather than a source of pride. Sister Marie-Jeanne, identified in revolutionary documents as the king's daughter by a girl from the Parc aux Cerfs, left a spiritual diary that speaks of the burden of sin that preceded my existence and her struggle to find meaning in a life defined by circumstances beyond her control. Some of the more fortunate bastards were provided with marriages to minor nobles willing to overlook their origins in exchange for generous dowries. The marriage contract of Agnès Louise de Montreuil, acknowledged privately as the king's daughter, included a dowry of 200,000 livres and an annual pension of 12,000 livres. Her husband, the Comte de Montreuil, was a debt-ridden cavalry officer who treated his wife as a meal ticket rather than a partner. Their loveless marriage, documented in family letters, produced 3 children who would later struggle with the stigma of their grandfather's identity.